Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. For today's episode, we are joined by Julia Metraux. Julia, thanks for coming on the podcast today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good in California. It's a little hot today, but other than that, very good.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We're going to get into really quickly the reasons why I brought you onto the show, because I have a few different reasons why I asked you to come on the show today. But first and foremost, just going to give people an understanding of who you are. You are a journalist who has been involved in doing journalism for over 10 years now. Can you just briefly just tell the people just what made you decide to get into journalism and what types of pieces do you normally write about?
Yeah, well, my start to journalism is a little boring. I started my high school paper when I was a freshman, and I kept on going. I was an econ major for my first year of undergrad because that's what both my parents are in business. So I'm like, okay, I'll do econ. Then I didn't like econ, and I'm like, you know what? I like journalism. Then I finished my undergrad with a degree in global studies, and during my second half of undergrad, I interned at a bunch of places. And since I graduated in May 2020, I've been a freelance journalist. I do a lot of health reporting, and what got me into health reporting is my lived experience with vasculitis. When I was 18, I developed an autoimmune disorder. I didn't know what it was for a year and a half. I was being told at hospital that maybe you have anxiety, maybe you have lupus. And then I finally got diagnosed. And so I was diagnosed slightly after my 20th birthday. I'm 24 now. I still write about health journalism, but I'm passionate about a bunch of other topics. I also like weird cultural things too. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
You know, you kind of just stole my next question from me, but it's completely okay. That's actually the thing I wanted to lead into next. Can you just go into a little more detail about what is vasculitis? Because that's how I found you in the first place. You had made I found you previously, but I saw you make a post about vasculitis awareness, and I wasn't sure what it was until I went and like read about what you had talked about. What exactly is it, and how does it affect like your life and your ability to do your job?
Yeah, so vasculitis is actually a family of diseases. I specifically have hypocomplementaric urticarial vasculitis, which I am possibly also mispronouncing. It's a bit of a mouthful. So there's about 20 different kinds, and like the different kinds, they vary based on which organs are affected. I'm fortunate now that I'm on medications like colchicine, which help me manage, but on a day-to-day basis, I deal with a lot of severe fatigue. When I'm in flares, I deal with pretty severe inflammation, which also affects my lungs to the point where I've been hospitalized and had to be put on oxygen, which has been very scary. I haven't had that happen in a while, knock on wood, but yeah, and it's been interesting to live with. I also deal with quite a bit of pain in my hand. I'm not exactly sure that's from me typing way too much as a person in general or from my vasculitis, probably a combination of the both. But on a day-to-day basis, it's difficult. I think what helps me is that I'm someone who generally likes writing, and I like what I do. I wanted to be a journalist since, 14, could be a kid. So it's something that I've just kept on doing and I like doing. And it's also led me to write different health stories. I think it's been helpful over the pandemic, which is still very much continuing for people like me who are high risk. And also because vasculitis is a blood vessel condition, I also have a lot of empathy for people who get COVID and who are now experiencing long COVID because, wow, different conditions, I have dealt with many of the same symptoms, but yeah.
Right. And that's another thing I wanted to kind of go into like deeper with you for a second here. You had briefly kind of like mentioned your experience trying to just even get like a diagnosis for what you're going through. What was your experience like with our healthcare system? Because we always hear about, you know, like how our healthcare system kind of like functions in America from like an outside perspective, but being in the process of trying to figure out what's like going on with you and trying to figure out like what you were experiencing, like how did that affect you and how long did that process really take and what was it like?
Yeah, I kind of joke about, but it is kind of awful. It took the entire North American continent to get me a diagnosis. I'm originally from Winnipeg. I lived there 0 to 6, then in Massachusetts 6 to 18. When I was 18, I went to McGill University for a year and a half, which is in Quebec. I was a new college student, and I was also newly chronically ill, and I was terrified. At first, I got really sick and was hospitalized for about a week during midterms. I think I had a very bad flare up of my vasculitis due to a mix of stress from my first midterms in university, as well as it got really cold suddenly. And while I've always lived in cold areas before coming to California, where I am now, I had developed a chronic illness where whenever the temperature changes a lot, I get sick. They did some testing. First, they thought I had lupus. I know it's a joke that people are like, oh yeah, they always test for lupus. In their defense, a nickname for my type of vasculitis is unusual lupus-like syndrome. So like they had a point. I know they did some differential diagnosis, and of course, zero shame and stigma to people who have these conditions, but like, I know that they tested me for syphilis, and they also tested me for HIV, which I did not test positive for. But I think being an 18-year-old and even knowing they're testing for HIV was pretty scary. And then I was told I had anxiety. Something that quite a few people didn't know, I didn't know this. And also I was in Quebec in the second half of 2016 and 2017. The wait list, if you're over 18 but still young to get into specialists, can be way too long. So I didn't get a rheumatologist while living in Quebec. So when I was sick, I would go to the ER. The wait time to ER would sometimes be 6 to 10 hours, unless my oxygen level was below 90%. They would let me in earlier if it was below 90%. But if not, they're like, oh yeah, you're in pain. You're just in pain. Other people are there before, they're going to go before you. And I'm like, of course that there are obviously people who need to go before you in the emergency room. Of course, like there's always going to be people who are coming in cardiac arrest and stuff like that. But I was waiting 10 hours, like sometimes and I remember the last time I went, which was a 10-hour wait. Wow. I was like sitting in an uncomfortable hospital chair, and my body was going between feeling nothing and feeling shock and then feeling pain and like that cycle. And then they took me back, and then they're like, well, you have some inflammation. Well, it turns out my blood vessels are inflamed. So that was the issue. The summer between my first and second year, I'd started to see a rheumatologist. However, during the summer, I wasn't flaring, so they couldn't take any tests to really diagnose me then. So it wasn't like but then my doctor in Massachusetts has asked some doctors in Quebec if they could test me. No one would. Then after I left McGill, I went on vacation to Puerto Vallarta. Then I had a very bad flare where my C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation, was close to, I wouldn't say exactly, but close to the range of someone who's had a heart attack or like a really bad infection. I was sick. I looked horrible. I was in the hospital for 10 days. However, a doctor looked at me and he's like, based on your age and your appearance, you either have lupus or vasculitis. I'm like, it's not lupus. They tested for vasculitis. I've been diagnosed with vasculitis since then. That's been confirmed with every hospital I've been at since. So yeah, that's been my journey. And like, for me, it was only a year and a half, but I was sick. Even though, and I hate to say only a year and a half, but the truth is like some people wait like 10 years to get a diagnosis with certain chronic illness.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's unfortunately true. I happen to know from certain experiences, the healthcare system can be atrocious at finding diagnoses for people. You know, when it comes to, just besides challenges with dealing with our medical system, have you also experienced any challenges, I guess, like in your time as a journalist, in the sense of like, working with other people, maybe like people in like, workplace environment or in school environment who just didn't understand what you were going through, or didn't respect the kind of challenges that you might be facing with vasculitis?
Yeah, so I've been freelance. I've had gigs, but it's been mostly flexible. I think I've been very hard on myself at times because I experience, especially when I'm flaring, but honestly, multiple times a week, pretty significant brain fog. I normally get a low grade fever at least once a week due to vasculitis. And it's like, I get mad at myself because I'm like, you're not doing anything. I think that my frustrations was at school, within grad school, has more been about COVID, just because it's not over. I think that we know nothing about long COVID, and I don't think that we should, even if COVID vaccines and boosters are lowering the chance. I say as someone who has a chronic blood vessel condition, even though we're still learning how long COVID works, it is triggered by a blood vessel disease. It's not easy to manage. And while like, of course, there's nothing wrong with having a disability. I've had other disabilities before developing this one. Like I was born with a mild to moderate hearing loss, but there's a difference. It's harder to navigate being sick often, and it's hard navigating being sick in a profession where you're always supposed to be on. Like, I don't really do breaking news, but I forget his name, but the Mac guy for CNN.
Steve Kornacki.
No, the other, that's MSNBC, but there's,
Oh yes. I forget what his name is,
we
but
can
yes.
fill in the blank. I do not mean to forget his name, but I'm fairly sure after the last presidential election,
Yeah.
he said that like, oh yeah, I have multiple sclerosis. And if you saw me like not doing well towards the end, that's it. And I'm just like, oh my God, someone who's chronically somehow worked those hours. I feel bad possibly that, of course, I don't know him personally, so I can't say whether or not he felt forced to do it. But I think that, like, for me personally, I don't think I could ever be a straight political reporter, because those hours, especially near election time, it's just not good for taking care of yourself. Even if you don't already have physical health conditions, I think that we all saw how often Steve Kornacki, who's very passionate about his job, was literally not, well, I wouldn't say, maybe sleeping a few hours a night at most and working like 20 hours a day. Our bodies aren't made to do that. And
No.
so, no, like, I feel like for me, it's also, there's some things in journalism that's like, I could want to do, but I'm like, you know what, that's not the best for me. So I'd say political reporting, if it comes to the expectation that I can't rest, is not the field for me. But yeah.
You know what? It's interesting because rest is something that has been completely, I think, prior to the start of the pandemic, we have been living in a time where we've just been like working our population to death, and
Mhm.
people didn't really understand the true nature of how important it is to rest. And now people are finally, like, I think, appreciating that more now that people did have to spend some time more at home throughout this pandemic. But speaking of the pandemic, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about now specifically is, for someone like who has, the condition that you have, how has it been living through this pandemic? Because as we know, this does affect people who are in a quote unquote like higher risk category more than everyone else. So specifically, how has it been like for you navigating through this?
Yeah, it was a lot of the unknowns at first. I have a friend who's I was in New York City actually, right as it hit there. But I have a friend from Wuhan, and I asked him, okay, should I ignore what American leadership is saying and stay inside? He's like, yes, do that. So like I was already, I guess, careful going into it. Then I went back to Massachusetts. I was part of the exodus from New York, just because I knew I could stay inside more. My doctor also agreed that was probably safer for me. I also say I'm probably luckier than many people with vasculitis, is that I don't have active organ involvement at the moment. Sometimes my lungs get triggered by smoke, secondhand smoke, some other things, but it's like I'm not dealing with going to dialysis for my kidneys so there's definitely people with vasculitis who definitely are in more danger. So essentially I wasn't allowed in Massachusetts. I would have been able to if I stayed in New York. I think one thing that's been wild, just looking at also COVID-19 vaccine distribution, is that it changed so much per state. So like if I stayed in New York, I would have been able to get it mid-February 2020, but in Massachusetts, it wasn't until April 2020, which is still extremely early in the scheme of the world. I think one thing I'm always thinking about is how research has shown that a lot of these variants likely developed in people with immune systems who aren't great like mine, and yet we didn't give vaccine access around the world. It's horrible. So what if we just shared the vaccine earlier? There's a possibility we won't be dealing with this. But back to and so there was a lot of unknown to just like, how high risk am I? And then in November 2021, there was a study that came out from the Lancet or the Lancet, I always forget, but it's a huge health journal. And there was a study that was done internationally, and they found that people with vasculitis prior to getting vaccinated have a 15% mortality rate, which is very high. And that is because our blood vessels are already inflamed. I have not gotten COVID yet. Of course, like there's no shame in catching an infectious disease. It is infectious. That is how it works. But I also really do not want to try, even though I am double vaccinated and double boosted. I don't want to do trial and error on myself to see how sick I could possibly get. And that's why I say, as someone who's learned to somewhat manage her vasculitis since being on prednisone, being on colchicine, I don't want to have all that work undone, because I am feeling better than I was a few years ago, and I don't want to have to deal with going back through that journey.
Makes perfect sense to me. And I definitely want to ask you about, this is a political podcast, so we have to ask you about how our government's response to COVID has impacted this country. But before we do that, we're gonna take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll have more questions with Julia. Stay tuned. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. So before the break, we were talking about, the pandemic and how it affected you specifically. I kind of want to turn the gear a little bit now towards our government. There was a lot of criticism from both administrations about how they handled the pandemic. Specifically for you, maybe not just with the pandemic, but maybe just an overarching idea in general. How has, the government kind of how has their actions or inactions affected people with disabilities during this time? And what do you think they should have been doing differently?
I think at a bare minimum, I think this is what we more need to do as a society with many issues. If someone tells you they're being harmed, listen to them and don't discard it automatically. I know that there has been a lot of disability advocacy organizations. While I'm a journalist, I don't personally consider myself to be an activist. I consider myself to be a journalist who has lived with chronic illness and tweets without a filter. But there has just been a lot of things that have been dropped. Mask mandates being a huge example of them. I am very disheartened every time I hear of a story of an outbreak that could have been prevented, just because when we know there's outbreaks related to government events, we know the politicians are going to be taken care of. We don't know if anyone else is going to be taken care of. there was a dinner, I think at this place called Gridian, a few months back. I could be totally butchering the name. It was with Democratic politicians and some journalists. There was a huge I wouldn't say huge because I don't technically remember the quantification on top of my head. Pelosi got COVID from that. Then there was also an outbreak at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. People got COVID. And so I just have a lot of questions about also not just a failure of policy, but a failure of being a member of the community who wants to protect other people. Like, for example, like whenever you see those happen, I'm like, okay, do the servers who were working that night, do they even have health insurance from their employers? Would they get access to healthcare? What barriers do they have? Because when I would say probably significant, like a congressperson or a governor, someone like that gets COVID, they get the antiviral drug, they get very good care. Not everyone gets very good care. And so that's been something that's frustrating me just because it's like, okay, I wouldn't automatically call most politicians selfless people. And I think that how many of them have been acting in recent months, Democrats included, have been showing that they're not willing to protect members of their community. I am grateful whenever I see something, I forget where, I say it might have been the State of the Union address or something. I saw Senator Ed Markey, who was my former senator when I was in Massachusetts. I believe he's one of like 5 people wearing a mask of like members of the Senate. And it's like, and he tweeted something about, he's like, yeah, I'm wearing a mask because we're still in a pandemic. I'm like, thank you for tweeting the obvious, but it almost has to be the obvious. Yeah, and it's just like, we know that if we don't have measures to stop COVID, it spreads. How many times do we need a new variant to show that's how COVID works? People shouldn't have to die or get very sick or even get mildly sick and now have a chronic illness for evidence. Like, how much evidence is enough? Because we have the evidence.
That's a question I've unfortunately been asking myself a lot recently with recent gun issues in our country, but I'll save that for another conversation. When it comes to being a journalist, I kind of want to tilt back to this for you for a second. What is a story that you've done recently that you wish more people were aware of?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I have some stories in progress, but I don't want to jinx anything until they come out. I can talk about, I'm also trying to think, what has come out for me recently? I could say one story that, I apologize, I do not have this on.
Oh, it's okay. Recently for myself, I've had several stories that I've covered, like on my podcast that I felt like were incredibly, just important to me, thinking about like stories happening in Afghanistan, stories happening, here in America with guns and, with the filibuster, talking about legislation coming through. There's always certain, I guess, stories I feel like you just get personally attached to because of how, I guess, just how ridiculous some of the circumstances are surrounding the stories themselves and trying to just amplify certain people's voices. Has there been something like that in particular for you recently?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it fits exactly that, and it was definitely a short story because I ran a JSTOR Daily and they're short blogs, but I definitely wanted to find an example of Americans helping another country to not their own self-gain, particularly in Russia, right when the war in Ukraine was starting. Because I think I wouldn't say we, because not everyone agrees with me, but like the US has definitely involved themselves in foreign affairs to their own self-interest. I personally, as someone, so half my family, my ancestors, they're from what's now Belarus and Poland, and like they fled. And so like, there are definitely issues with existing anti-Semitism and other issues in Russia and former countries that used to be part of the USSR that like really bother me as a person. I found an example of, so essentially in around the 1920s, New York Jews, quite a few were immigrants themselves from Eastern Europe or their parents before them. I found that there's evidence that they used to sneak organizing materials for like labor rights in Yiddish into Russia to
Oh,
help
wow.
Jews organize and that started like a mini labor movement among Jews in Eastern Europe. And although it was short and didn't involve like really any reporting from my end, it just seemed like an important example to me of like people wanting to help people who are still part of their community in not a way that the original person had like their self-interest, because it was just because they wanted to help these people from this area of the world that they come from get labor rights, and
Right.
it kind of worked.
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating story. I honestly, as someone who spent a little bit of time covering, what happened over in Russia and Ukraine over the last few months, that's been really interesting to me, kind of like learning more about that region because it's a region that I just didn't know that much about. I want to kind of like shift back towards the conversation we were having before, though, just as like our final question here. When it comes to this whole conversation, we were talking a lot about disabilities, how it's impacted you, how it's impacted your life, how it's impacting society. What what is it that you wish that people who don't have a disability at all kind of like knew about people with disabilities, as somebody yourself who writes a lot of pieces about people who are experiencing disabilities? And why is it important to talk about this subject so much?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons that I'll kind of spit out. The first thing is I think it's important to recognize, both for people who consider them disabled and those who don't, is that a lot of people benefit from accessibility, even if they don't consider themselves to be part of the disability community. I also know people who have health conditions which could be considered to be disabilities who don't consider them to be part of the disability community. And that's, of course, is a choice, but everyone benefits from accessibility. There's something called inclusive design where, on sidewalks where they kind of dip a little bit when you go up, that's
Yeah.
like an example of something being made for example, someone in a wheelchair, but it helps everyone. And so I think thinking about accessibility is great. I also think that it's important to have, of course, recognizing that disability is a spectrum and that people also have a spectrum of feelings about disability. You shouldn't feel bad for someone because they have a diagnosis. You shouldn't, for example, think that their life isn't worth it. I think that this is something going in Canada, and it's something that just with everything happening in the US these past few weeks, I don't consider myself to be an expert on by any means, but Canada has expanded MAID, medical assisted in death. I think that's what it's called. It's so essentially waiting a few years or waiting a long time for healthcare if you're chronically ill is a reason that you would be approved for medical assistance in dying. That I think is incredibly problematic because of course, people can and should make their own choices, but that shouldn't be the only option when the issue is wait times.
Right.
And so I think that who are the politicians, who are the policymakers who thought that this was a suitable alternative? Do they not see that people's lives, the people who are chronically ill and disabled, as not being worthy? Because a lot of us live incredibly worthy lives, and you just need more accessibility. Some people might need more support from their community, but of course, don't touch anyone without their permission, as some people do that. Unfortunately, should be go without saying, ask for consent. But I think that, and a note that I want to end on about disability and COVID and all this stuff, and I'm probably going to misquote this, is that there was a piece from Ed Young in the Atlantic that roughly said that when you're caring about disability and chronic illness in the high risk people and you're making changes within that space, you're caring for your future self and like the future self of those around you, just because with what we know with aging, even if you don't have a disability or now, you're likely going to develop health related issues as you age. And so
Right.
like, it's also like, if people want to be selfish, about COVID and long COVID, why not take COVID seriously? That's also what I think too. Because it's like, you might be dealing with complications down the road. Be selfish. Stay inside. I wouldn't say necessarily always stay inside, but like take precautions. It's like you should care for people who are medically vulnerable, of course, but you can also do it for yourself.
Julia, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really do appreciate you coming on and talking to us about your experience with vasculitis and, you know, the work that you've done as a journalist. Where can people find out more about you online after this?
Yeah, so there's only one other person with my name and she's like no social media footprint. So I am very Googleable. I know she runs a bed and breakfast with her husband in Switzerland. But you can find me on Twitter. It's Metraux, so METRAUX _Julia. And my Instagram is julia.metreux. Also, just to like give a precaution, I don't give medical advice personally for vasculitis. I will send you all the links. However, if you ask me any questions, but yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And for those who are interested, those links will be in the episode description right now. If you liked this episode, please go ahead and share it on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, tag Independent Thought. Definitely send me a DM afterwards. Tell me what you thought of the episode. Thank you so much for everyone who came to Independent Thought today. We will see you in the next episode.